In this video, I'd like to give you a little bit of background information about Chapter 1, A View of Life. This chapter is basically an introduction chapter to a lot of the topics that we'll see in more detail as we go through the course. Of course, biology is the science of life. It's the study of living organisms. And so throughout the course, we're going to be looking at living organisms through the study of cells and tissues, the different processes that take place, such as photosynthesis and cell respiration, and then different types of organisms a little later on. And so the chapter kind of starts out looking at just some of the major themes that you're going to see in biology. Your textbook gives you 5 major themes. We're going to go through these kind of individually. You can see them listed here for you, but we'll go through each one kind of individually. The first one is biological systems interact. And so you'll notice if you take a look around you, look at different biological organisms, you'll see how they interact within their environment and with each other. And so biological systems, whether you're talking about a population of plants or animals, they're going to have some type of interaction with other individuals in that population or in their environment. The second major theme here is structure and function are interrelated. Let me give you an example of this. Below you can see that horses and wolves have teeth, but they're designed differently. They have different structures, and those structures allow them to function in different ways. And so you're going to find that, again, if you're studying animals, you'll see how structure and function go together. If you study plants, plants have particular structures that allow them to have unique functions as well. Then another major theme is information must be transferred. And so that doesn't matter if you're talking inside of an organism, inside of a cell. We're going to be talking a little bit more about cells in this chapter, but also more. There's a whole chapter that deals with what a cell is, what's inside of a cell, and the different main parts or the organelles of a cell. But information inside of the cell, outside of the cell, that information usually is some type of chemical base or electrical signal that can be transferred from cell to cell, from cell to tissues, from individual organisms, and even from one generation to the next. And so that's kind of a look into your genetic information or your DNA. Then another major theme here, life depends on a continuous input and transfer of energy. And again, we'll have a whole nother chapter that deals with energy. Of course, one of the main types of energy that you'll start learning about is ATP and how that plays a role in all the different biochemical reactions that take place inside of the body. Lastly, populations change over time through the process of evolution. And so things begin to evolve. Your DNA begins to change through time. And so there's a little bit of information here that talks about how ancestry of organisms, you can trace back to different forms of life. Now, the second section talks briefly about characteristics of life. And so they list for you 6 main characteristics. You can see them listed here, 6 main characteristics of living things. In other words, if you looked at something, how would you know that it's living? And so these are 6 criteria that living things all share. And you may think, well, this is very basic, because if you look at a person or an animal, then it's very easy to tell that that is a living organism. But if you consider other things such as bacteria, how do you know a bacteria is alive? How do you know a virus? Is a virus alive, or is it an inanimate type of a structure? So these basically are definitions or characteristics of living things. And so we'll talk about each one of these briefly. So the first one is organisms are composed of cells. And so I said before, we'll look at a whole chapter that deals with cell biology. And so you have some of the basic ideas of cells here. New cells are formed only by division of previously existing cells. They just don't come out of nowhere. You have cells and a process called cell division that creates new cells. And then you see that you have some vocabulary words here, unicellular life forms and multicellular life forms. Some biological organisms exist only as a single cell. So for example, bacteria. If you look at E. coli bacteria, you're talking about a single-celled organism. Most organisms would fall into the categories multicellular. They have more than one cell, and so those cells generally are organized to form things like tissues and organs and organ systems. This slide just kind of gives you some information about some of what you're going to find about a cell inside of a cell, such as a plasma membrane that's on the outside of the cell. That's the envelope around a cell. There's certainly many different types of specialized molecules, such as DNA or carbohydrates or lipids or proteins. DNA, of course, is your genetic information, the molecule that carries genetic instructions. And then I've mentioned this word a couple of times, organelles. It just means small organs. These are structures inside of cells that basically perform out specific functions. So, for example, in the cell biology chapter, you'll study about ribosomes. Ribosomes are organelles, and their function is to make proteins. And then these are two good definition words here, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. These are two basic types of cells. Prokaryotic cells are the simplest, and the examples here include bacteria. And so bacteria, your example for a prokaryotic cell is bacteria. They don't have a true nucleus. Their nucleus is really not enclosed by a membrane, what's called a membrane-bound organelle. They wouldn't have a true nucleus, or they really don't have a nucleus at all. They still have genetic material, but it's not surrounded by a membrane like we think of as a true nucleus. Everything else would fall into this category. Everything else would be a eukaryotic cell. The word here, eukaryote, literally means a true nucleus. And so they have organelles that are enclosed by different membranes. The nucleus, the mitochondrion, these have membranes around it. And chloroplasts for plants, they have membranes around it. And that's, of course, the nucleus is where you'll find most of the cell's DNA. Another characteristic is that organisms grow and develop. And so if you look at the technical definition for growth, you basically are talking about growing in size. You're getting larger. Cells get larger, but they also develop, and that just means they become more mature. And so they go through certain metabolic transformations that allow them to, mature into a different type of a cell. And so, for example, a stem cell is a non-differentiated cell. It hasn't matured yet. And so a stem cell could mature and become a hepatocyte, a liver cell, or an adipocyte, an adipose fat-storing cell. So development defines that particular cell. Metabolism is a characteristic of life. Organisms regulate their metabolic processes. In other words, they use energy to go through different types of chemical reactions. And so these chemical reactions are essential for nutrition because many of them are needed to get the energy that the organism needs, or the chemical reactions are there to help to grow and repair. So organisms need to make muscle tissue, and that muscle is made out of proteins. And so you have to have chemical reactions to take the building blocks of proteins, put them together to make the muscle tissue. Organisms respond to stimuli, another characteristic of living things. They have a response, and the stimuli is what causes them to have some type of change. And so a physical or chemical change in the environment, it could be inside of the organism, it could be outside of the organism, external or internal, that could cause some type of response. And so think about what types of responses you have. If you hear a loud noise, you respond. If you see a bright light, you respond. And so these are examples of stimuli that cause organisms to respond. And so living things respond to changes in the environment. So for example, plants. Plants respond to light. They respond to gravity, touch, water or the lack of water. And so plants, therefore, are considered to be living organisms. You may recognize this, a Venus flytrap. and it has sensors inside of the plant head here that will respond to touch. And so whenever something touches that, in this case a fly, it causes the fly trap to close. It's a response to a stimulus. Organisms reproduce. Now, reproduction, there's different types of reproduction. This picture and the slide is talking about asexual reproduction that does not require transfer of genetic information from one cell to another, but instead it allows a cell to just go through division. It goes through mitosis. And so we'll talk about cell division in another chapter. But this, for example, bacteria will go through asexual types of reproduction. Most of the time you think of reproduction usually as sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction requires that you have a combination of genetic information. And so in this case, the definition here is a fusion of an egg cell and a sperm cell. And that's fertilization that creates a fertilized egg cell or a zygote. And that would be an example of where genetic information is transferred from one organism to another. And that would be sexual reproduction. Another characteristic here is that populations evolve and become adapted to the environment. Those adaptations are listed, or the definition is listed here for you, inherited characteristics. Inherited characteristics that give, that enhance really the ability for survival in a particular environment. And so those adaptations allow for the survival of that species in that particular habitat, and that particular environment. And so it kind of gives you ideas of that. Those adaptations could be structural, could be something on the body itself that gives that particular organism an advantage, could be physiological, biochemical, or behavioral, or somewhere in between. Some combination of all four of those may give that particular population an advantage in that particular environment. Now, organization is very important in biological systems, and so you kind of see here a list of how organisms are organized, and the smallest living portion is what's called a cell. We've already mentioned that, but you have below that you have atoms and molecules that make up that cell. So you have chemicals that make up a cell. Then those cells work together and kind of come together, and they form what's called a tissue. And so a tissue is basically an association of cells working together. Then tissues work together to form what's called an organ. And so if you're thinking about a heart or a liver or a kidney, these are organs made up of tissues that function together. Then organs categorized together create an organ system. And so if you've studied a little, if you ever take anatomy classes, you'll talk about 11 different organ systems in the body. And so you may study the urinary system, or you may study the digestive system. And so you're looking at all of those organs and their interactions in the human body. And then once you have all of the organ systems in place, then you have the complete organism, multicellular organism. So this just kind of shows you the hierarchy of how things are interrelated. Beyond the organism, I've used a couple of these terms already, but beyond the organism, you have population, communities, and ecosystems. Population is whenever you're talking about all of the individuals, all of the members of one species that are in that particular group. So you could study a population of dogwood trees, or a population of lions in a particular environment. And so you were talking about one species, but all the members together. A community is even larger than that, because community includes different types of populations. So you're talking about different species living in a particular area. And then ecosystem is even more broader, because that encompasses even the non-living parts of the environment. So, you know, if you're talking about an ecosystem that includes not just the living organisms, but includes, you know, the water around it. So you can have a marine ecosystem, a saltwater environment, or you could have a grassland area that, you know, has not just the grass, but it has flattened flattened plains, and so not very many mountains. And so you can look at the ecosystem also in terms of light and water. If you put all of the ecosystems together, you have what's called the biosphere. And if you study ecology, that is basically what this is looking at. If you study how all of these different organisms interact with each other and also with their surroundings. All right, section 4 briefly talks a little bit about information transfer, transferring information from one organism to another. And of course, that's through, I put a little picture here for you of the DNA molecule. So I'll mention just a few things about the DNA molecule. You've got several chapters that deal with genetics later in the semester. And so this is just an introduction here. DNA is basically a double helix. So that means you have two strands of atoms that are twisted together, kind of like a ladder that's twisted on its axis. And so you have a chain of these that have different subunits together called nucleotides. There's 4 different types of nucleotides. You're going to go through this in much more detail later on. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine are your base pairs or your nucleotides that make up the DNA code. The main objective here is to transmit genetic information from one generation to the next. There's a little section here talking about communication between cells. Briefly mentioned that before. That's through chemicals or electrical signals. And so here you have hormones. These are chemical messengers that transmit or allow cells to communicate within the body. And then your nervous system is basically electrical signals that transmit information either through chemicals called neurotransmitters or through electrical signals. And of course, outside of the organism, communication between organisms can take place through chemicals or visual displays and sounds. This is how different organisms communicate to each other. Section 5 gives you an introduction to energy, the energy that's needed for living things. And so biological organisms all need to have a continuous input of energy to survive. And you have some energy terms here associated with ecology. Self-sufficient ecosystem includes these things: producers, consumers, and decomposers. And you see different categories here. Autotrophs. Autotroph is a word that just means that organism has ability to produce its own food, such as plants. Plants are autotrophs. Plants can take sunlight energy and convert it into the nutrients that they need. And that's the process called photosynthesis. Heterotrophs have to eat things in order to get the energy. They can't produce their own food, and so they consume producers. They eat other things. And then you have another group called bacteria and fungi, and these are part of the decomposer list, and they can break down the non-living type of organic material to get the energy they need. Bacteria and fungi, well, bacteria anyway, can do a couple of different things. Some bacteria can produce their own food. They can be photosynthetic as well. Briefly mentioned here, here's your definition for photosynthesis, but we have a whole chapter dealing with photosynthesis. Here's the definition: the chemical process that utilizes carbon dioxide, CO2, takes in water and light energy, and that creates glucose, a sugar-type energy that's used for energy needs for the autotrophs. And you kind of see a brief definition before you. CO2 plus water plus energy from the sun or sunlight energy or some kind of light energy creates glucose as an energy source and produces oxygen as a byproduct. Cell respiration is a reverse of that process. If you notice the equation is just a reverse of the photosynthesis equation. Here you take glucose and oxygen and you go through a series of chemical reactions to make energy, and in the process you release CO2 and you release water. And so again, there's a whole chapter that talks about the processes taking place for cell respiration, how biological organisms create the energy, and this energy is in the form of what's called ATP. Section 6 here just mentions a few things about evolution. We've already mentioned that briefly, the process by which populations of organisms change over time. And as they do that, this involves passing the genetic information, genes, DNA sequences from those new traits from one generation to another. With that, you can study, you have a couple of terms here. Biologists used what's called a binomial system for naming organisms. Right? Binomial means two names. And so there's each organism is assigned a two-name type system. We'll talk briefly about that. Got a couple of definitions up here for you. Systematics, the study of the diversity of organisms and their evolutionary relationships. One easy way to think about systematics is it's like studying a family tree. And so if you've ever done some genealogy in your family, if you've ever looked up some family tree information, you basically have done a little bit of systematics. And so it's looking at relationships between individuals or populations or organisms or different species on that type of a scale. Taxonomy is similar, but taxonomy is about looking at the name. How do you name a particular organism? How do you classify it or categorize it into different groups? Well, in the 18th century, there was a scientist, Carolus Linnaeus. He was a botanist, a naturalist, and he basically came up with a hierarchical system of naming, categorizing different organisms that's pretty much used the same way today. There's been some adjustments over the years, but his basic model is still used today. With that, the two-name system, the binomial system, includes a species name and then a genus name. The species is defined here as a group of organisms with similar structure, function, and behavior. There's sometimes questions about how do you define what is a species. Sometimes it's pretty easy, that you can see, one species is different than another species, but sometimes the differences are not that distinct and becomes a little more challenging to determine, is that really a new species or not? And so there's been adaptations to the definition of species over time. Here you see a couple of definitions. One definition is that a species is capable, members of the species is capable of breeding with one another. They're able to reproduce, and that's a great definition. So if you think about certain species of animals, cows only reproduce with cows and not horses. And so that makes cows a different species than a horse. So that's a pretty easy definition. But if you think about something like bacteria, bacteria, based on those characteristics of life, are living organisms. But many of them go through asexual reproduction. So, there's no, it's not a clearly defined species definition when it comes to things like bacteria. And so usually you have additional definitions. So the second one here is another definition, a population with a common gene pool. In other words, they share genetic information. And so this would relate to all forms of living things. Then if you take a species and you group it together, you have what's formed, you have what's called a genus. And so closely related species would be shared in a group called a genus. Now the word in parentheses is the plural form of genus called genera. So you would have one genus, a single genus, but if you're talking about multiple genus, you would have multiple genera. Now, Linnaeus set up this system. The first part is the genus. That's the first part of the two-part naming system is genus. The second part would be the species. I'll give you an example here of a dog. The genus for a dog is Canis, and the species is Familiaris. And a wolf, the genus is Canis, and the species is Lupus. Notice that a dog and a wolf both share the same genus name. They both belong to that group. So that means they have similarities. There are similarities between dogs and wolves. And so for that reason, they belong to the same genus. But obviously there's very distinct differences between dogs and wolves, and so that's why they are in different species categories. Then, in addition to the two-part naming system, there's other classifications. And so genera that are closely related are grouped into what's called a family. And families that are closely related are grouped into orders, and orders into classes, and kind of keeps going up and up the hierarchy. Classes into phyla. Phyla, again, is in this case plural. Phylum is singular. Multiple phyla are grouped together into a kingdom, and then lastly, you have a domain. This little table, this is a nice table because it gives you examples of three living things: a cat, human, and a plant, a white oak tree. And it shows you the hierarchy system listed here. And so you can see that cats, humans, and white oaks are all belong to the same domain. We belong to eukarya because we are eukaryotic organisms. We all have true nuclei. This would be different. They didn't show you bacteria on this particular slide. If you put bacteria out here, it would belong to a different domain. It would belong to the bacteria domain. Kingdom here is for cats and humans, animals, the animal kingdom, Animalia. For the plants, they belong to the plant kingdom, Plantae. And you kind of go down the phylum, the class, order, family. Then you come down to the genus and species. Again, the genus is Felis for cat. Species is Felis catus. For genus, for human is Homo, and for species is Homo sapiens. The oak is Quercus, and then Quercus alba for the species. Then the last part of this is that you can create what's called a cladogram. This is kind of your tree of life design that is basically a branching diagram that kind of shows you how closely related these organisms are biologically. And it can be based on different things such as the structure of the organism, or it can be traced on based on things like its DNA sequence. So here's an example of a cladogram with members of different areas. Here you see the domain bacteria, and so you kind of see how it's way out here. And then there's another bacteria domain called Archaea. It's out here. Then a little closer in here you have protists, and how protists, and then you have plants. The plants and the protists, because they're combined here, that just means that they are more closer related than, let's say, a plant and bacteria. Animals and fungi have more DNA in common than animals and plants, or animals and protists. So this kind of gives you, again, a family tree of different groups of living organisms. Last couple of things here is that species adapt in response to changes in their environment, and every organism is the product of interactions between environmental conditions. So that's inanimate associations in their environment. It could be rain conditions, water conditions, sunlight, heat, drought, whatever the case may be, and the genes, their genetic inheritance from their ancestors. And so they need to be able to, organisms need to be able to adapt to those changes in the environment in order to survive. And through that adaptation, you have genetic adaptations, and that comes in the form of mutations. So your genetic material can mutate or change, and that may provide some adaptation to help you. Most of the time, we don't see this, because it takes place. It takes many thousands or millions of years to take place. One area that you can see this, though, is, say, for example, maybe the flu virus. Viruses, genetic information changes very rapidly in viruses. And so a flu virus can mutate and change in a very quick time, within a few years, and that causes it to have genetic changes that allow that particular virus to adapt and survive in different conditions. Last little section we'll look at is the process of science. I'm briefly going to review this. This is basically talking about the scientific method. You have a definition here, a series of steps in which scientists do different things. They make observations, they look around, they ask questions about a particular problem. From those observations, they begin to develop a hypothesis, an educated guess, an educated assumption about that data. Then they begin to test those hypotheses. They create experiments. They use those experiments to test the hypothesis, to gather information in the form of data, to analyze that data, and then they can draw conclusions from that information. So you have basically a 5-step process in the scientific method.